What would you do if everything you believed turned out to be a lie? Not a small lie. Everything. You were told your entire life that capture meant torture and death. You were trained that surrender equals ultimate shame. You watched friends choose death rather than face the enemy. Then you get captured, and you discover the enemy gives you 3 meals a day, medical care, and baseball equipment. Would you feel relieved? Or would your entire worldview collapse? Because that choice between dying for a lie and living with the truth broke the minds of thousands of Japanese soldiers in World War II. And when some of them saw inside American POW camps, they did something unthinkable. They voluntarily surrendered their swords. In Japanese military culture, your sword is your soul. Giving it up willingly is like admitting your entire life was based on a lie. Thank you for being here. Please subscribe to keep us going forward. This is the story of how abundance defeated propaganda, how 3 meals a day became a weapon more powerful than bullets, and why some Japanese officers begged to surrender after seeing what American torture actually looked like. The clash between what soldiers believed and what they discovered changed how wars are fought. And the choice those soldiers made between honor and truth haunts their descendants still. August 1942, Guadalcanal. A Japanese soldier named Yasuo Kuwahara hides in the jungle. He's been hiding for 3 days. No food, no water. His unit was overrun by American Marines. He's alone. He knows the Americans are searching for survivors. He also knows, absolutely knows, that if they find him, they will torture him to death. This isn't a guess. This is what he was told in training. His officers showed him propaganda posters of Americans bayoneting prisoners, cutting off heads, burning men alive. Every Japanese soldier receives the same instruction: never surrender. If capture is inevitable, kill yourself. Save the last bullet for yourself. If you have no bullets, use a grenade. If you have no grenade, charge the enemy and die fighting. Anything but surrender. Because surrender means torture, mutilation, and death so horrible that suicide is mercy by comparison. Kuwahara is 19 years old. He's thirsty. He's so thirsty his tongue is swelling. He can hear Americans moving through the jungle. They're calling out in Japanese, "Come out, you won't be hurt. We have water. We have food." He knows this is a trick. Obviously a trick. They want him to reveal his position, then they'll kill him. But he's so thirsty. 3 days without water. He starts thinking maybe quick death is better than slow death from thirst. He makes a decision. He'll wait until they're close, then charge them, force them to shoot him. Quick death, honorable death. Death as a soldier, not as a prisoner. He raises his hands and walks out of the jungle. He doesn't know why. His body just does it. His mind is screaming at him to stop, to fight, to die properly. But his body walks toward the Americans with hands raised. He's crying. Not from fear of death. He accepted death days ago. He's crying because he's surrendering, which is worse than death. He's betraying everything he was taught. He's shaming his family. He's dishonoring the emperor. The Americans see him. They point rifles. He closes his eyes and waits for bullets. Instead, someone hands him a canteen. "Drink slowly," they say in broken Japanese. He drinks. The water is cool and clean. Nobody shoots him. Nobody beats him. They take him to a truck and drive him to a camp. He's confused. When does the torture start? The camp is a fenced area with tents. There are other Japanese prisoners inside. Maybe 40 of them. They're sitting in shade. They're talking to each other. Nobody looks tortured. Nobody looks beaten. Kuwahara expects this is temporary. Maybe they torture prisoners later, after questioning. An American soldier, a medic, examines him, checks his wounds. He has infected cuts on his legs from jungle thorns. The medic cleans them, applies medicine, bandages them. Kuwahara is so confused he can't speak. Why are they treating his wounds if they're going to kill him? Then comes dinner. Rice, canned meat, fruit. More food than he's seen in weeks. Even when his unit was at full strength, they didn't eat this well. Japanese supply lines to Guadalcanal are being cut by American submarines. Soldiers on Guadalcanal are starving. Kuwahara's unit was eating grass and bark before the Americans attacked. Now he's a prisoner and he's eating meat and fruit. This makes no sense. Everything he was told is backwards. Prisoners eat better than soldiers. He asks another prisoner, a man who's been here 2 weeks. When the torture starts, the man laughs, not cruelly, sadly. There is no torture, he says. This is how they treat prisoners, all prisoners. Kuwahara doesn't believe him, can't believe him. Because if this is true, then everything else is a lie. Let's pause here and understand what's happening in Kuwahara's mind. He wasn't just told that Americans torture prisoners. He was trained in this belief from the moment he joined the military. Japanese military culture in World War II was built on several core ideas. First, surrender is the ultimate shame. A soldier who surrenders disgraces himself, his family, his ancestors, and the emperor. Death is always preferable to surrender, always. Second, the enemy is inhuman. Americans are devils who torture for pleasure. They rape and murder. They desecrate bodies. They are not human beings. They are monsters. Third, Japanese soldiers are spiritually superior. Material disadvantage doesn't matter because Japanese spirit and discipline will overcome American softness and materialism. These weren't suggestions. These were absolute truths taught to every soldier. Now imagine you believe these truths absolutely. You've trained for years accepting these ideas. You've watched friends die rather than surrender. You've seen soldiers save their last grenade to blow themselves up rather than be captured. You've heard stories, confirmed by officers you trust, about prisoners being tortured. Then you get captured, and none of it is true. Zero. The Americans don't torture you. They feed you. They give you medical care. They treat you better than your own army treated you. What happens to your mind? Some prisoners went insane, literally insane. The disconnect between belief and reality was so severe their minds broke. Some refused to eat, thinking the food was poisoned. Some waited every day for the torture to begin, unable to accept that it wouldn't. And some, slowly, painfully, began to realize they'd been lied to about everything. Here's what made American POW camps in the Pacific so shocking to Japanese prisoners. It wasn't luxury by American standards. It was basic decency. 3 meals per day, medical care, shelter, clean water, recreation time. Some camps had baseball equipment. Some had books and radios. Prisoners could write letters home, though Japan usually didn't deliver them because acknowledging prisoners existed meant acknowledging surrender was possible. The camps followed Geneva Convention standards for POW treatment. These standards said prisoners must be fed the same rations as the captor's own soldiers, must receive medical care, must not be tortured or abused, must be allowed recreation and communication. Japan had signed the Geneva Convention, then ignored it completely. Japanese prison camps for Allied soldiers were horrific. Starvation rations, systematic brutality, forced labor. Medical care was almost non-existent. Thousands of Allied prisoners died from disease, starvation, and abuse. This isn't included to score points or create equivalence. It's included because it explains the contrast. Japanese soldiers were taught that Americans would treat Japanese prisoners the way Japan treated Allied prisoners. When they discovered this wasn't true, it shattered their entire understanding of the war. By 1943, the U.S. military recognized that well-treated Japanese prisoners were valuable intelligence assets. Prisoners who realized they wouldn't be tortured started talking. They provided information about Japanese positions, tactics, and plans. More importantly, they could be used for psychological warfare. The U.S. started dropping leaflets over Japanese positions. The leaflets had photographs of Japanese prisoners eating meals, playing baseball, smiling. The leaflet said, "This is how America treats prisoners. Your officers lied to you." Most Japanese soldiers ignored these leaflets, but some didn't. Some started wondering, If the photographs were fake, why did they look so real? If this was propaganda, why would Americans waste resources printing it? The sword surrenders started in 1944. A Japanese officer, a captain, was captured on Saipan. He'd been wounded and left behind when his unit retreated. American medics found him. They treated his wounds, gave him blood plasma. He'd lost a lot of blood. Saved his life. When he recovered enough to understand what happened, he asked to speak to the American commander. Through a translator, he said he wanted to surrender his sword. This is significant. Japanese officers carried swords, not ceremonial, actual swords they used in combat. The sword represented the officer's honor, his family lineage, his connection to samurai tradition. Officers would commit suicide with these swords rather than surrender them. For an officer to voluntarily give up his sword meant he was acknowledging complete defeat. Not just military defeat, but spiritual defeat. The American commander didn't understand the significance at first. He thought the officer was just disarming. But the translator explained, this officer was making a statement. He was saying, I was wrong about everything. You defeated me not just militarily, but morally. You showed me that my beliefs were false. I surrender not just my weapon, but my worldview. The commander accepted the sword respectfully. He treated it as a significant gesture, not a trophy. Word spread through the POW camps. An officer had surrendered his sword voluntarily. Some prisoners were disgusted. This officer had disgraced himself and all Japanese soldiers. But others started thinking, if an officer, someone trained even more thoroughly in Bushido and honor, could recognize the truth, maybe the truth was worth recognizing. More sword surrenders followed. Not many. Most Japanese soldiers never surrendered. They died fighting. Of those who did surrender, most were captured wounded and unconscious, giving them an excuse within the honor system. But dozens of officers, from Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, voluntarily surrendered their swords after spending time in POW camps. Each one represented a complete psychological transformation. These weren't men who gave up because they were weak. These were men who gave up because they recognized that strength and weakness had been defined backwards their entire lives. Here's what the POW camps revealed about American abundance versus Japanese scarcity. America could afford to feed prisoners the same rations as soldiers because America had unlimited food production. Ships brought supplies constantly. Warehouses were full. Wasting food on prisoners wasn't even a consideration because there was always more food. Japan couldn't feed prisoners because Japan could barely feed its own soldiers. Supply lines were cut. Resources were scarce. Every grain of rice given to a prisoner was rice taken from a soldier. The difference wasn't cruelty versus kindness, though cruelty was certainly present in Japanese camps. The difference was abundance versus scarcity, creating completely different systems. Medical care tells the same story. American medics treated wounded Japanese prisoners with the same care as wounded Americans. Plasma, antibiotics, surgery when needed. Japan had plasma and antibiotics too, but not enough. Japanese military doctors had to decide who got medicine and who didn't. Prisoners obviously weren't priority. Often, wounded Japanese soldiers weren't priority either. Resources went to soldiers who could return to combat. The wounded who couldn't fight were left to die or given minimal care. American abundance meant nobody had to choose. Treat everyone. Medicine existed to be used. The recreation is what broke many prisoners mentally. Baseball fields in POW camps, sports equipment. Some camps had small libraries with Japanese books donated by Japanese American communities in the US. Prisoners could play games, exercise, socialize. They had free time. This concept, that prisoners would have recreation, was incomprehensible to Japanese soldiers. In Japanese military culture, every moment was dedicated to duty, training, or rest for more duty. Free time was suspicious. Recreation was for the weak. But in American camps, prisoners played baseball. They taught each other English. They formed friendships. Some even started baseball leagues between different camp sections. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. How can these be the same monsters we were told about? Monsters don't organize baseball games. By 1945, the U.S. had captured about 40,000 Japanese soldiers out of millions who fought. That's an incredibly low capture rate. Most Japanese soldiers still chose death over surrender, but those 40,000 represented a propaganda victory America exploited. Photographs of Japanese prisoners, healthy, well-fed, smiling, were dropped over Japanese positions constantly. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with prisoners describing their treatment. The message was always the same. You've been lied to. Surrender is not death. Surrender is survival. Your officers told you Americans are devils. Your officers lied. Did this propaganda work? Sometimes. A few hundred Japanese soldiers surrendered voluntarily in the last months of the war, citing the leaflets and broadcasts. That's a tiny number compared to millions of soldiers. But every voluntary surrender represented a crack in the system. Japanese military discipline was absolute, until it wasn't. Each prisoner who walked out with hands raised made it slightly easier for the next soldier to consider surrendering. The idea that surrender was even possible began spreading, despite official denials. Here's the uncomfortable question. Was it moral for America to treat Japanese prisoners well when Japan treated Allied prisoners horrifically? Some American soldiers struggled with this. They'd seen friends die in Japanese prison camps. They knew about the Bataan Death March, where thousands of Allied prisoners died from abuse and starvation during a forced march. They knew Japanese forces had committed massacres of prisoners and civilians. Then they were ordered to treat Japanese prisoners with respect. Give them food, provide medical care. Some soldiers refused. Some guards in POW camps were deliberately harsh, bending rules, making prisoners' lives difficult. But official policy was clear: treat prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. Not because Japanese prisoners deserved it, though they did, all prisoners do, but because it was strategically valuable and morally right. The strategic value was information. Japanese prisoners who realized they wouldn't be tortured became talkative. They described Japanese positions, defensive plans, supply situations. This intelligence saved American lives. One Japanese prisoner revealed the location of a massive ammunition dump on Okinawa. American bombers destroyed it, eliminating a major threat. Another prisoner explained Japanese tunnel systems, helping American forces devise tactics to clear them. The information from well-treated prisoners was worth more than anything extracted through torture, which doesn't work anyway because people being tortured say whatever they think will make it stop. The moral value was proving that America meant what it said about freedom and human dignity. If America fought for these values, America had to demonstrate them even toward enemies. Treating prisoners well wasn't weakness, it was strength. It showed that American values weren't negotiable based on convenience. This mattered after the war. Japan rebuilt as a democracy and American ally, partly because defeated Japanese soldiers remembered being treated with dignity. They remembered American medics saving their lives. They remembered baseball games in POW camps. They told their children and grandchildren that Americans had been generous in victory. That memory shaped post-war Japan-US relations. Let's return to Yasuo Kuwahara. He spent 2 years in an American POW camp. During that time, he learned English. He played baseball. He made friends with other prisoners who were also struggling with the disconnect between what they'd been taught and what they were experiencing. When the war ended and he returned to Japan, his family was shocked he was alive. They'd been told he died heroically in battle. The Japanese government didn't acknowledge that prisoners existed. Finding out he'd survived as a prisoner brought shame to his family and their community. Some relatives refused to speak to him. He'd brought dishonor by surviving. Kuwahara wrote about this later in life. He described the psychological torture of being well treated as a prisoner. American guards were kind to him. They gave him food and medicine. They treated him like a human being. And this kindness destroyed his sense of identity. He'd been trained that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Living as a prisoner was the deepest shame. But the Americans didn't treat him as shameful. They treated him as a soldier who'd been defeated, which every soldier risks in war. This normalization of surrender, treating it as an unfortunate outcome rather than ultimate disgrace, was more psychologically damaging than torture would have been. Torture he could have resisted. Torture would have confirmed his beliefs. Kindness destroyed his beliefs and offered nothing to replace them with except the truth. He'd been lied to. And friends had died for those lies. Other prisoners had similar experiences. Some refused to return to Japan after the war. They stayed in the US, built new lives, tried to escape the shame of surrender by never going home. Some returned to Japan and lived quietly, never discussing their wartime experience. A few became advocates for peace, speaking about what they'd learned in American camps, that enemies could treat each other with dignity, that propaganda on both sides had dehumanized the other side, that war was worse than either side admitted. The sword surrenders continued even after the war. Some Japanese officers kept their swords when they returned home, technically illegal but often overlooked in post-war chaos. Years later, some of these veterans contacted American veterans they'd met as prisoners. They arranged meetings, and they formally presented their swords, explaining that they wanted to complete the surrender they'd begun decades earlier. These ceremonies were private and emotional. Old men who'd been enemies meeting as friends, acknowledging the shared trauma of war and the strange bond between captor and prisoner when the captor treats you with unexpected humanity. Here's what connects to modern life. How often do you believe something absolutely, only to discover you were wrong? The Japanese soldiers believed surrender meant torture because authority figures they trusted told them so. They had no reason to doubt until experience proved otherwise. We all carry beliefs like this, things we assume are true because we've always been told they're true. The only way to test these beliefs is exposure to different perspectives. The Japanese prisoners got that exposure through force. They didn't choose to be captured, but once captured, they couldn't avoid seeing the truth. Most of us aren't forced into these revelations. We can choose to seek out information that challenges our beliefs, or we can stay comfortable in assumptions that might be wrong. The abundance versus scarcity theme runs through this story like a river. America had abundance, food, medicine, supplies, and chose to share it with prisoners. Not from pure altruism, but because abundance made sharing strategically smart and morally possible. Japan had scarcity and chose to hoard even from their own soldiers, creating a system where survival meant someone else's death. These choices shaped how each side fought and how each side treated both soldiers and prisoners. Abundance allowed mercy. Scarcity encouraged brutality. This pattern repeats throughout history. Societies with abundance tend toward more humane treatment of prisoners, criminals, and vulnerable populations. Societies with scarcity tend toward harsh treatment because resources for mercy don't exist. Whether a society chooses to create abundance or accepts scarcity as inevitable determines how that society treats people at the margins. The propaganda victory of well-treated POWs changed American military doctrine. After World War II, the U.S. established clear policies. Treat prisoners well, document that treatment, use it for psychological operations. In Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts, American forces emphasized prisoner treatment as both moral obligation and tactical advantage. It didn't always work. Abuse happened, rules were broken. My Lai and Abu Ghraib proved that policies don't prevent all crimes. But the official position remained. Treat prisoners humanely because it's right and because it works. Enemies who believe they'll be treated fairly are more likely to surrender, ending combat faster with fewer casualties on both sides. Japan learned different lessons. Post-war Japan built a military culture that explicitly rejected the death before dishonor mentality of World War II. Japanese self-defense forces today teach that surrender is acceptable if continuing to fight accomplishes nothing. Soldiers are valuable, not expendable. Preservation of life is a higher value than dying gloriously. This represents a complete reversal from World War II doctrine. The change came partly from American occupation influence, but mostly from Japanese veterans who'd survived as POWs and knew that the old way led to needless death. The swords themselves became symbols of reconciliation. Many of the swords voluntarily surrendered by Japanese officers ended up in American museums or private collections. Some families of American veterans who received swords have returned them to the families of Japanese veterans who surrendered them. These returns are ceremonial. Japanese families often don't want the swords because they represent shameful surrender. But the gesture matters. It acknowledges that the war is over, that former enemies can show mutual respect, that objects can carry meaning beyond their immediate purpose. One more story. In 1985, a Japanese veteran named Hiru Onoda visited the United States. Onoda is famous for refusing to surrender until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war ended, because he didn't believe Japan had surrendered. He'd been hiding in the Philippine jungle conducting guerrilla operations for 3 decades. When he finally accepted that the war was over, he formally surrendered his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. During his U.S. visit, Onoda spoke at military academies. He told American officers that he'd been wrong. Not wrong to fight for Japan, that was duty. Wrong to believe that surrender was worse than death. He said he'd wasted 30 years of his life hiding in a jungle because he couldn't imagine that the war was over, that Japan had surrendered, that surrender was survivable. If he'd known that Japanese POWs had been treated well, he might have come out sooner. The propaganda about American torture had been so effective that he chose 3 decades of isolation over the risk of capture. Onoda's story is extreme, but it illustrates the power of belief over reality. He had evidence the war was over, leaflets, radio broadcasts, newspapers. He rejected all of it as American tricks because his core belief, that Japan would never surrender and that capture meant torture, was unshakable. Only when his former commanding officer traveled to the Philippines and personally ordered him to stand down did Onoda accept reality. How many smaller versions of this happen in normal life? How often do we reject evidence that contradicts deeply held beliefs? How long do we hide in metaphorical jungles rather than face truths that would require changing our minds? The final numbers. Approximately 40,000 Japanese soldiers became prisoners of war in American custody during World War II. Of roughly 5 to 6 million Japanese soldiers who fought, that's less than 1% captured alive. Compared to European theater, over 7 million German soldiers surrendered to Allied forces. The difference isn't that Japanese soldiers were braver. The difference is that Japanese soldiers believed surrender wasn't an option. They'd been trained, propagandized, and culturally conditioned to choose death. Most did choose death. The 40,000 who survived as prisoners represented failures of that conditioning. Men who were wounded and couldn't resist capture. Men who were so starved and sick they couldn't fight. Men who made split-second decisions their training hadn't prepared them for. Those 40,000 men discovered that everything they'd been told about capture was false. They discovered that abundance could defeat propaganda. They discovered that the enemy they'd been taught to hate treated them better than their own officers had. Some couldn't process this and went insane. Some processed it and felt crushing shame. And some, a few dozen officers, processed it and voluntarily surrendered their swords, acknowledging that truth mattered more than honor, that being wrong about everything was better than dying for a lie. The choice those officers made, giving up the symbol of their identity, admitting complete defeat, not just militarily, but philosophically, haunts their families today. In Japan, there's no memorial for POWs, no recognition that these men existed. The cultural shame of surrender is so deep that even discussing it is difficult. Some families of POWs hide that history. Some have burned letters and photographs rather than let younger generations discover that an ancestor survived as a prisoner. The shame persists 3 generations later, but some families have chosen differently. They've acknowledged that their grandfathers or great-grandfathers were prisoners. They've researched the POW camps, contacted American veterans, tried to understand what happened. These families often conclude that survival was actually the brave choice. Dying was easy. Propaganda had prepared soldiers to die. Living required courage because living meant facing shame, carrying dishonor, and rebuilding an identity from nothing. The question we're left with is whether those Japanese officers who surrendered their swords made the right choice. By their culture's standards, they made the worst possible choice. They chose survival and truth over honor and glory. They betrayed everything they'd been taught. But by universal human standards, they made the only reasonable choice. They recognized that they'd been lied to and chose to live in truth rather than die for lies. Both perspectives are valid. Both create suffering. The officers who surrendered suffered shame. The soldiers who chose death suffered death. There's no good answer. There's only the choice each person makes when confronted with the gap between what they believe and what is actually true. 2 more stories on screen now. One about another group of soldiers who discovered everything they'd been told was wrong. One about the choice between comfort and truth that everyone eventually faces. Watch them. See if you'd make the same choices these soldiers made. Thanks for watching this far. That means you're willing to sit with uncomfortable truths. That's rare. Don't waste it.